Here are a few things I would expect President Trump to have on his mind after a series of whirlwind meetings with pretty much all of Europe. I'd expect him to be thinking about Ukraine, Russia, security guarantees, maybe arms sales. But if you listen to Trump's interviews and press availabilities, you'll notice he keeps returning to a very different topic, a topic much closer to home.
Vladimir Putin said something, one of the most interesting things. He said your election was rigged because you have mail-in voting.
This is Trump speaking with Sean Hannity back on Friday.
He said mail-in voting, every election. He said no country has mail-in voting. It's impossible to have mail-in voting and have honest elections. And he said that to me.
Apparently, he spoke to Putin about mail-in voting, and Putin told him that it's open to fraud. And, who better to listen to about how to run a democratic country and a fair election than Vladimir Putin?
Rick Hasen is an election law expert. So this pivot, it was of special interest to him, especially because the president followed this comment up with an actual action plan of a sort, one he posted to Truth Social.
And it starts by saying that he's going to lead a movement to get rid of mail-in ballots. And while we're at it, I'm reading here, highly, quote, inaccurate, close quote, very expensive and seriously controversial voting machines. And then he goes on to say that we have massive voter fraud and Democrats are going to fight this. He said there's going to be an executive order that's going to bring honesty to the 2026 elections.
To be totally clear, Donald Trump can't unilaterally make states get rid of mail-in voting, right?
That's right. He can't, by royal edict, get rid of mail-in balloting. That's maybe why he leads his post by saying, I'm going to lead a movement. Anybody can lead a movement. You can lead a movement about mail-in balloting. I'm not really worried about that. I mean, it's not nearly as bad as using the power of the presidency, say, to send ICE officers into the streets of Los Angeles around polling places, which is something that I don't think is outside the realm of possibility.
I mean, that's terrifying.
Yeah, well, I've been thinking for months now about what we have to do to try to assure that we can have fair and safe elections in November of 2026. And I used to worry only when Donald Trump was on the ballot because it didn't seem like he really cared about these other elections. He didn't do much when he was president in 2016 as the 2018 elections. He didn't really interfere in those elections. But I think now Donald Trump has more on the line because the Democratic Congress could make his life miserable.
Today on the show, why Trump's attack on mail-in voting may be just the beginning. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. When you visit the doctor, you probably hand over your insurance, your ID, and contact details. It's just one of the many places that has your personal info. And if any of them accidentally expose it, you could be at risk for identity theft. LifeLock monitors millions of data points a second. If you become a victim, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Do you guys spend any time reading comments? Just be honest, be honest.
I try not to.
I always read the comments.
Hi there, I'm Kate Lindsay, and I host Slate's internet culture podcast, ICYMI, with Candace Lim. Twice a week, we scroll through the depths of online spaces so you don't have to. And in a recent episode, we talked all about viral debates and Jubilee media. You may have seen their videos on your feed with titles like Gay Men Test Their Gaydar and One Progressive versus 20 MAGAs. While their headlines seem wacky, the biggest Jubilee videos always seem to end the same way: online rage.
I just think it perfectly encapsulates how far we've gone in terms of normalizing just the most egregious racism and people getting excited about defending the indefensible because of all the rewards they get for being edgelords.
Listen to the entire episode now, featuring Slate staff writer Ayman Ismail. And be sure to follow ICYMI wherever you get your podcasts.
I just want to say something, you and I together. This is one of those observations which I could make it every day of the week, but I do think it's worth calling out the sheer hypocrisy of President Trump attacking mail-in voting because he has voted by mail. And also in the last election, the Republican National Committee encouraged people to vote by mail, like launched an online tool to help Pennsylvania voters request mail-in ballots. They promised it would be the most secure process. Like, it's wild to me that we're seeing this moment now where the line is mail-in voting is bad when in 2024, it seems like mail-in voting certainly didn't hurt the Republican Party.
Well, I think you're right. And I think that what Donald Trump is doing is probably giving a lot of Republican campaign people heartburn.
Why?
Well, first of all, if you go back, mail-in voting was really the province of Republicans. You know, in California, Republicans were the ones that voted by mail. Then what happened is after the 2000 election, there was really a push on the Democratic side towards getting more early voting going, whether in person or by mail. The idea is if you could bank these votes early, then you don't have to worry about get out the vote on election day because you can kind of tick off here the people that have already voted. And so Democrats achieved kind of parity with Republicans on mail-in balloting. But Republicans have very serious mail-in ballot operations in places like Florida, for example. They're very successful in getting these ballots in. And so I think in 2020, Trump might have lost that election because he discouraged mail-in balloting in the middle of a pandemic. And so in 2024, he kind of backed off and said, yeah, mail-in balloting is great. And Republicans said that. And if you look at Pew surveys of people's satisfaction, Republicans were much more satisfied with the fairness of the process and with mail-in balloting in 2024 than in 2020. Of course they were, because Trump wasn't criticizing it as much and because Trump won. So they figured the system must have been working.
I mean, Trump has said the U.S. is the only country in the world that does mail-in voting, which is not true, right?
Right. It's not true. And it's also, he tried to distinguish at one point between mail-in balloting, which he said was bad, and absentee balloting, which is good, and they're the same thing.
Absentee ballots are great. You request a ballot, I signed an absentee ballot. Absentee ballots are great. They work, they've been proven, they're good, like in Florida. But this universal mail-in is a very dangerous thing. It's fraught with fraud.
It wasn't clear what exactly he meant. The guy is not a paragon of clarity, so it's hard to know. But so making voting harder is going to hurt Republicans potentially in 2026. If you look at what's going on with the Republican Party and how Donald Trump was able to win in 2024, it's not clear to me. Now maybe what Trump wants to do is target his, attacks on mail-in balloting in blue states only or whatever. But remember, we're talking about control of Congress here. So it's not just about statewide totals. It's about how do people vote in each congressional district. So even hurting mail-in balloting in blue states is potentially self-defeating.
Because in blue states, the marginal voters might be Republicans, people more interested in the GOP, people you want to turn out if you're a Republican.
Yeah, if you actually had faith that these low-propensity voters who turned out for Trump would actually turn out in the midterm elections, then you'd want to make voting as easy as possible.
Because all the evidence for midterm voting is that these are like highly interested voters who turn out for something like a off-year midterm election, right?
Right. And that, too, until recently, benefited Republicans. It was Republicans that overperformed in midterm elections because they had more voters who were whiter, richer, older, more likely to turn out to vote. And now with the party coalitions shifting, those are the voters who are going to turn out. These are the people that are going to climb through glass to be able to vote against the Republican Party come November 2026.
Okay. So you've laid out the executive doesn't have the authority to order the states around when it comes to how people vote. But you've also said that Congress does have a lot of authority here. I guess I hear that and I think Trump is kind of running Congress right now. Do you think there's a world in which Congress is doing what Trump wants, here and finding some way to get involved in mail-in voting and other kinds of voting?
Are you ready for me to blow your mind?
Oh, boy.
Let's put all of our hope in Mitch McConnell.
Ha!
So back a few months ago, the House, led by Mike Johnson, on a mostly party line vote, passed something called the SAVE Act, S-A-V-E. This is an act that would require documentary proof of citizenship to vote in congressional elections. So you want to register to vote in a congressional election, you've got to produce your birth certificate or a naturalization certificate. And if you're married and you've changed your name, you'd also have to produce a marriage certificate to show all of that.
I'm exhausted just thinking about this.
Yeah. So that passed in the House and went to the Senate, where it has been lying dormant. Part of the reason it's lying dormant is there are people like Mitch McConnell who strongly believe that states should be the ones running elections, who do not want the federal government to be dictating more of the rules for how states run their elections. And so he's been resisting. So I think we are safe from new legislation getting through Congress that would make voting harder or that would interfere with the 2026 elections. What we're not through is the potential for Trump to try to say existing law that he's trying to enforce gives him the power to do X, Y, and Z. That's more like what I would be suspecting.
One of the things that Donald Trump has been talking about at the same time as mail-in ballots is voting machines, which is wild because, the same day that Trump is announcing he wants to restrict the use of voting machines somehow, again, this is not within his authority, Newsmax settled with Dominion Voting Systems. The news organization had to pay $67 million because of all of what they were saying about voting machines back in 2020. So it's like we have on one hand this evidence that all of the shenanigans around voting machines and were they somehow flipping people's votes, et cetera, that is not true. At the same time that the president is saying we got to get rid of these voting machines. How will this play out? It also sounds like a nightmare if I'm a county clerk, to be honest.
I don't know. And, one of the things I can tell you about elections is that they take a lot of preparation. When you think about, what it is to run an election and to do it fairly and to do it transparently, it's very complicated. And so I don't know. And I think there's going to be a lot of resistance on the part of state and local election officials and elected officials who hear from their election officers. Nobody wants to be the laughingstock who can't run a good election. And so, there'll be lots of lip service towards Trump, but in terms of actually changing the rules with everybody watching, it's going to be harder than I think some people might expect.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm thinking about how the president has been obsessed with the idea of getting election results on election night. He really wants that. And I'm like, yeah, try to do that without a voting machine. Man, we got hundreds of millions of people in this country.
It's, aside from going to war, what else is it that this country does all at once, in the national interest that requires so many people and where the stakes are so high? If something goes wrong, especially in this atmosphere, it could make a huge difference to the trajectory of the country.
We'll be right back.
This week on Amicus, Slate's podcast about the Supreme Court. The state attorney general fighting for his people in the face of the Trump administration's lawlessness.
In life, you don't really know when you're being tested. We are in a test right now. We're in a test as a nation, and I think we're in a test as a profession. And the only way we get through it is by believing that we can have an impact and that we can keep doing things that slowly but surely get us through that period.
I'm Mark Joseph Stern. This week, I talk with New Jersey Attorney General Matthew Platkin about his state's fight in the birthright citizenship case and what state AGs should be doing to resist the Trump administration. Listen to Amicus now, wherever you get your podcasts.
One of your colleagues at Election Law Blog, Justin Levitt, wrote about this effort from Trump's Department of Justice to get states to hand over voter rolls. I guess the idea is to build some kind of national voter database. How do you think about that in this moment? We're talking about how our voter system is incredibly localized. This feels like an effort to suck up all that localized information into a federal process or system.
We've seen this move before from Trump. Back in the first Trump administration, Trump created a commission headed by then Vice President Pence and Chris Kobach of Kansas, a noted voter fraud warrior type person.
Enthusiast is
Yeah.
how I would put it.
Hobbyist.
Hobbyist.
Kobach and Pence tried to get this data. They got a lot of pushback from states, and that effort was shut down. So now there's an effort to do it again. Again, it's hard to know what the end game is, and there may be multiple end games. One is to maybe try to create some kind of national database to look for fraud. Oh, look, Mary is registered in 2 states. Well, maybe it turns out that there's 2 Marys with the same name, even the same birth date in a country of 300 million people. You're going to have some duplicates. But it's also partly a PR effort. Like, look at all this waste. Look at all these dead people that are listed as registered. Of course, those people are not showing up and voting.
If you're a local election official, is your job right now to resist these efforts or what?
I think if you're a local election official, your job is to follow state law. And it's really what state law requires, what state law allows. In some of these fights over access to these voter registration lists may end up in court. It's just if it's maximum warfare everywhere all the time, you're just going to expect it to pop up every place that it can.
I want to dig in a little bit to this idea of the courts with you, because I do think that when it comes to voting rights, the courts are not necessarily a backstop. And we see that, the Supreme Court has said in this last session, it punted on a voting rights case, Louisiana v. Calais. They're going to hear it again this year. That one, it's all about voting rights. And I wonder how you think about how what's happening at the Supreme Court muddies that water.
So I think you're right to draw this distinction. And what I'd say is that for my recent book, A Real Right to Vote, I went back and looked at the Supreme Court's entire history in terms of protecting voting. It turns out the court had a good 8-year stretch out of over 200 years in existence where it led on voting rights.
8 years.
We can't expect the courts to lead on voting rights. I mean, the court's doing worse than not leading on voting rights now. They're being aggressively anti-voter. But so far, most of the time, the federal courts at least have been protecting against election subversion. That idea that you're going to make sure that the winner of the election can actually take office, that is something that it's as much of a bedrock of democracy as anything else. Like, we're going to fairly count the votes. We're not going to change the rules after the election was run. And as much as I've criticized the courts for undermining Congress's powers on voting rights and for allowing unlimited partisan gerrymandering and all kinds of things that courts have done, courts have mostly held the line against election subversion. That is, cases where someone's claiming that the rules are being changed to turn the election loser into the election winner. And so I'd point you to a North Carolina Supreme Court race that we were all focused on after the last election. Months and months of fighting over this election until finally...
This is a judicial election for the Supreme Court.
That's right. And in that race, the state Supreme Court, the justices on that court, splitting not completely along party lines, but with Republicans in the majority, were going to allow the judicial candidate to change the rules of the election after the election had already been conducted and throw out some ballots. And the case went to federal court, and a very conservative Federalist Society judge sitting in North Carolina said, you can't change the rules of the game after the election is run. You can't treat similarly situated voters differently. And there
It's so funny because you're being optimistic here. You're saying, I saw this whole 6-month-long process where a state Supreme Court justice had to really fight for her seat. And look, it turned out okay in the end because of the courts, which is true. But I think there's another way to look at it, which is, damn, that took a lot of work for just the basics to be accomplished there.
Sure, you could be a pessimist. I don't call myself an optimist. I'm team resilience. Okay, so
Team reality.
so this is no, well, it's not even reality. It's this is like election law as self-help therapy. It's like what is in our control to actually be able to do, right? So what can you do? You can shine a light on what's going on. You can get involved in how elections are run. You can go to court. You can push your states to continue to do the right thing. And there have been many Republican states that have resisted Trump's efforts to try to interfere with how their elections are run. And if courts can continue to do that and protect that, that's not nothing. It's not the court we need, but it's better than nothing. And it may be the last defense against an attempt to try to mess with fair elections in 2026 and beyond.
So it's like you got to get yourself to the polls, but once you're there, the systems may kick in to make sure your vote is counted. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, it's not just that, but the idea is that you're going to have an election that's fairly run, where the rules are stated in advance as to how the election is going to be conducted. Those rules are followed, and the winner under those rules is able to take office peacefully. Low bar, I know, but let's hope that courts continue to protect that.
Can you give me some best worst case scenarios for the midterms 2026? Because you've been clear that what we're seeing now, this conversation about mail-in voting, voting machines, et cetera, it's really aimed at the midterm elections, preserving whatever Donald Trump has accomplished, which is a lot, in his first 2 years back in office. So give me a sense of what you think could happen in 2026. What keeps you up at night? And what, I don't know, when you think of a best case scenario?
Well, the best case scenario to start there is that there's enough resistance to these efforts that we can have a fair election. So between states and voters and courts, we can assure that any attempted meddling is resisted. In the worst case scenario, I worry about some states capitulating to Trump demands to change their voting rules, to do so in a way that could allow election losers to be declared the winner. I'm worried about the use of federal troops in American cities to interfere with people getting to the polls and with the counting of votes. I mean, a lot of these things really depend upon the willingness of people across the political spectrum to say, as I think most did in the case of that North Carolina state Supreme Court race, look, we have some very basic principles of democracy. Elections have to be run under the rules as they were set out before, and votes have to be fairly counted, and the winner gets to take office.
How would an election loser be declared the winner? Like when you think about like how that process would work, what do you think about?
Well, the North Carolina Supreme Court race is an example where under the rules as they were written, the Democrat was the winner. The losing candidate, the Republican, tried to have certain votes thrown out of certain voters in Democratic areas to try to change the vote totals. Or think about Donald Trump in 2020. Ken Paxton,
the Attorney General of Texas,
he filed a lawsuit directly in the Supreme Court trying to get the Electoral College votes thrown out in a bunch of states that had Republican legislatures, but that voted for Biden over Trump, places like Arizona and Pennsylvania. And that's an attempt to change the rules after the fact to turn an election loser into an election winner. And the courts so far said, no, can't do that.
To me, I look at the attack on mail-in voting, and I see both a real threat in that states could begin to change the way they administer elections, but then also a narrative threat where the more you say untrue things about the way we vote, the more you can then bring that to court and offer it as evidence that certain people's votes shouldn't count. Is that the way to see this?
Well, I think that the rhetoric is aimed less at the courts than at the public. So Rudy Giuliani back in 2020 was talking about fraud outside of court. But when he got into court and he was pushed by the judges, he said, no, I'm not claiming fraud, because you actually have to come forward with evidence in a court. But the rhetoric of stolen elections helps to delegitimize democratic victories. And I think that is part of the point. That's kind of Trump's backup. So even if Congress switches to Democratic control, he can rail against that Congress and say that Congress is illegitimate because it was backed by, it was fraud that got those Democrats into office.
Rick, I'm really grateful for your time. Thanks for coming on the show.
Always great to talk to you.
Rick Hasen is a professor at the UCLA School of Law. He's also the director of the Safeguarding Democracy Project, and he runs the Election Law blog. And that's our show. What Next is produced by Paige Osborne, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Anna Phillips, and Madeline Ducharme. Ben Richmond is the senior director of podcast operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. Go track me down on Blue Sky. I'm at Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. Catch you back here next time.